So, welcome to our Standing Committee on Climate Change and Environmental Stewardship. Our hearings this week are on a clean energy strategy, and it's for the purpose of studying pathways to decarbonization. Appearing this morning, we have Dr. Moe Qureshi, representing the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. So, Dr. Qureshi, I'll just take you through the structure of our committee. What we've been doing is allowing guests to present for 20 minutes, followed by questions from some of our members. Following the questions, we'll turn it back over to yourself for some closing remarks. So at this time, I'll give you the floor.
Absolutely, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and see so many familiar faces. I'd like to just start off this presentation with an anecdote why I'm interested in this topic. During my first year of my PhD, I had the pleasure of attending an energy conference that included a lot of executives from many different energy companies, including oil and gas, nuclear, and renewables. And I attended a talk that was hosted by the Chief Operating Officer of Shell. And someone asked him, what did he think about the renewables taking over the future? And he responded by saying, you know, technological advancements are increasing at such a pace that we replace them before its use comes to an end. And he said that, you know, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. The Steam Age didn't end because we ran out of steam. And similar with the fossil fuel age, it's not going to end because we ran out of fossil fuels, but just because we found better alternatives to replace them. So to begin my talk, I'd like to talk about the transition in New Brunswick. We've had the coal phase out, which is expected to be by 2030, and Belledune's expected to be off coal by then. And the federal government has implemented two new regulations called the Clean Fuel Regulations and recently proposed Clean Electricity Regulations. The Clean Fuel Regulations are ideally should be for a polluter's pay regulation to ensure that the cost of fuels and the emissions reported are there. The CER is a technology-neutral emission standard. It's a performance standard that requires that every fossil fuel or natural gas facility has a performance standard of 30 tons of carbon dioxide per gigawatt hour of electricity produced every year. This is not a random value. This was a value that was determined by in conversations with fossil fuel companies that if a natural gas plant were to have a 95% carbon capture rate, that's the amount of emissions that they'd produce. And the carbon capture technology has been estimated to reach those levels by 2035. There's also many peaker provisions in place, so a lot of people are worried that, you know, we can't just get off fossil fuels right away. Well, these regulations do allow for some provisions that can allow them to stay on as long as they reach those emission standards or the peaker provisions set in place. The RIAS, which is the Regulatory Impact Analysis Statement, shows some modeling, and from the models, it does show a disproportionate cost will be attributed to Ontario, Alberta, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia because they require a bit more of a transition than some of the other provinces. However, the modeling does not really include a lot of the budget 2023 and the new ITCs that are coming out that will help alleviate some of these costs for the Maritimes. And after that now brings us to New Brunswick's Climate Action Plan, which is a pretty solid plan overall. However, it would be nice to see some progress and updates on how the plan is going. And one of the parts of the Climate Action Plan states developing a clean electricity strategy by 2025. And in one of the subpoints, it mentions the role of renewable energy, distributed energy, and providing capacity support. So the Conservation Council's recommendations, this is a portion of our recommendations, but it includes an investment in a portfolio approach to electricity with a high priority on renewable energy, assess the viability of distributed energy resources, increase the build-out of transmission infrastructure such as the Atlantic Loop, and we urge that you guys commission an independent pathway assessment to analyze different net zero scenarios. Part two will be talking about affordability, addressing the backlog that NB Power has with the Enhanced Energy Savings Program, expand the definition of energy poverty to include social factors. In part three, the policy recommendations recommend updating and modernizing the Electricity Act and adding a sustainable net zero mandate to the Energy and Utilities Board Act. So part one from the Clean Electricity Strategy, I used section 68 of the Electricity Act to guide my reasoning here. And in there, it states that a transmission and distribution of electricity within the province should be managed and operated in a manner that is consistent with reliable, safe, and economically sustainable service. So with that in mind, how should we build a clean electricity strategy or a clean energy strategy? Well, what should we focus on? I first suggest looking at what New Brunswickers want. A lot of talk has come up about the social acceptance of many of these technologies, discussing different viabilities of them and whatnot, but a lot of these studies have already been done. There's a huge social acceptance for technologies such as wind and solar, and including rooftop and utility scale. And then after those technologies, we start seeing SMRs, biomass, and going down to the end, which is the fossil fuels. So, and considering a portfolio approach, if we look at NB Power's IRP, in one of their modeled scenarios, their scenario A, which is a high electrification and rapid pace technology development scenario, this scenario it considers, if all the other sectors are increasing in electrification. So, from this model, something that's often overlooked is that if we look at the wind and solar section here, there's about a 2,000 megawatt build out of wind and solar that I feel isn't being discussed enough. Everything is about, build out of SMRs, biomass, or hydrogen. And from all the models that I've seen, all of them show a significant build out in New Brunswick for wind. And so I'm here today to kind of push that further investment is needed in this technology. And next slide. And here's what I specifically recommend. From NB Power's IRP, they have the goal of building out 300 megawatts by 2027, and it kind of stops there. And I think that it should definitely be continued building out 100 megawatts every year all the way up until 2035. And the key thing that I want to stress with this is, if I can compare with SMRs for a second here, is that with wind, you can build, there's this iterative improvement that every year you're building it, it's going to get better and better and better. And the technology is getting better, the costs are getting better. And think of it this way, that it takes about 1 year to build 100 megawatts according to previous New Brunswick development. So I believe that they were able to build 100 megawatts of, I lost my here, sorry. Apologies. And so they were able to build out Kent Hills, which is about 96 megawatts, and the Caribou Wind Project, which is about 99 megawatts within a year. So I feel this is quite a reasonable standard to reach. And of course, the previous slide where I showed that NB Power predicts about 2,000 megawatts by 2045, this is what I'm suggesting to reach at least halfway before that goal. And of course, I also recommend doing 20% battery storage with it just to ensure reliability onto the system. And from our models that CCNB has done in collaboration with Navius and Enviroeconomics, we also see that there is a capability of about 30 megawatts of solar, that can be added to the grid either through rooftop or utility scale. So to move on, there's a lot of reports that have been published of the cost of various technologies. However, recently we discovered that NB Power received a cost analysis from E3, which is Energy Environmental Economics consulting firm. And for my analysis, I'm only going to be looking at this cost analysis because this is the first time I've seen a New Brunswick-specific cost for these varying technologies. So the conclusion from E3 was that onshore wind is the least expensive energy resource today and will be for the foreseeable future. So if we look at the graph as well, we'll see biomass, hydrogen, and SMRs as well. Biomass is proposed for replacing some of the capacity at Belledune. I will say there are some concerns about that because it is quite expensive, but also the way we report biomass emissions is not exactly accurate. A lot of it goes towards land use rather than the electricity sector. So it'd be nice to make sure that anything biomass related for the electricity sector is reported in the electricity sector. Similarly with hydrogen, hydrogen is getting a lot of popularity, but I do stress that making sure there's a difference between hydrogen as a chemical and hydrogen as an energy source. So hydrogen as a chemical is quite valuable for a lot of industrial processes to make fertilizer, to make steel. However, I don't think hydrogen is quite ready as an energy source. I still think electricity is a lot better. So when we talk about greening hydrogen, I think the focus should be on for industrial chemical uses of hydrogen before we really consider it as an energy source. And most of the hydrogen is currently being produced through fossil fuels anyway. So I do also want to stress that solar and wind are predicted to be less than half the cost of SMRs. And just to, not to say too many negative things about SMRs, but just to show the value of solar and wind over some of these other technologies. E3 also published the capital costs of a lot of these infrastructure. So it shows wind, solar, storage, and nuclear. But importantly, it shows the cost in 2020 and 2035. And at the far right, it shows the percent change between the cost now and the cost in the future. And just to give a crude example, what I did is I calculated what the cost would be for the 300 megawatt SMR, and just to show the value you can get from wind and solar from similar investments if we consider a portfolio approach. I want to stress that renewables are a lot cheaper and better than people give credit for. So based off the previous slide, if I do the math for a 300 megawatt SMR, in 2020 dollars, that'll cost about $2.4 billion. With that $2.4 billion and using the same numbers as the previous slide, you could build out about 1,200 megawatts of wind, which would reach that halfway goal that NB Power's IRP suggested for about 2,000 megawatts. Or you could build 1,246 megawatts of solar, 1,411 megawatts of storage capability, or if you want to get fancy with the vanadium 8-hour, that's about 520 megawatts. But the thing I want to stress is these technologies are getting cheaper and better every single year. So in 2035, if we consider the costs of a 300 megawatt SMR reactor, it had a decline rate of about 11%. So that means it will cost about $2.16 billion. And you could get far more wind and solar from that. So that's about 1,600 megawatts of wind or 2,000 megawatts of solar. And another thing with this iterative improvement I'm talking about is that when you build out 100 megawatts every year, let's say the one you built next year, it would break down in 2050. If you were to replace it, you would replace it with the newest model from 2050. But if you consider an SMR, it might take between 5 to 10 years to commission. It'll operate for about 60 years. Then it has possibly about a 5 to 10 year to decommission. So that's, let's say optimistically, about a 70-year cycle. So the next version to improve that technology won't be seen until 70 years from now. So I think wind and solar doesn't get the credit that it deserves, as this technology is getting better at such a faster rate compared to SMRs, which I still believe is still in the research and development phase. Next slide. Oh, it's not working. So the next part of my presentation, I want to talk about distributed energy resources. The analogy I like to give, it probably works with everyone wearing glasses, but if you have dust on your glasses, you can't really see it until you take it off, right? So Margaret knows what I'm talking about. So, I encourage that same approach. When we think of a clean electricity strategy for New Brunswick, we need to step back, analyze what we currently have and what modern technologies are there that can be offered. So our current electricity system goes something like this. You have one big reactor at a huge scale that has usually single direction transmission that goes and powers a lot of all the different cities and regions within New Brunswick. However, what happens when something goes wrong? Well, we do know what happens, especially if you look at NB Power's annual report last year. We did have La Pro go down, and we did have Bayside go down as well, which in 2022, I believe NB Power had a profit of about $80 million, and last year it was in debt by $43 million. So these large reactors, when they do go offline, it costs a lot of money. And it's very expensive to fix and to import all that electricity. In fact, it's so bad that a CBC article from yesterday showed that from La Pro's outages, PEI's electricity will increase by 33 cents. So it definitely has huge repercussions in the system. And when I consider, what could be a modern electricity system, I don't see it as singular large reactors anymore. I like to see it as a more distributed energy system, or distributed energy resources, which is mentioned in the Climate Action Plan and also from New Brunswickers themselves. So how it would look is that you have the same regions, but you could have some solar on rooftops or wind nearby in a more distributed geographic area, connected locally, and then with transmission, ideally bidirectional, so that way if it's not blowing in the top left, it could be blowing somewhere else, right? So you could trade, and more importantly, if something were to go wrong, it's a lot smaller problem to deal with. If one breaks, the other ones are still working, and you can replace that. And I put over there, that's kind of the ideal scenario of a VPP, that's a virtual power plant. That's looking at this entire system all combined, and you can see it on the cloud. You don't have to physically be there. All that data is transparent and available online right away. And with AI, it can optimize efficiencies. Distributed energy resources are currently being considered in Ontario. One of the biggest benefits of DERs is that it naturally incorporates a lot of smart grid technology, such as smart thermostats and battery storage. It provides customers with transparency and control, which I think is that should probably be number one. New Brunswickers want to know where their energy is coming from. They want to get more involved. That's what I've been hearing. So this is one way to show them that they can take control back of their electricity system. It can help lower system costs because it takes off a lot of demand from the provincial grid. It provides energy security because you have a lot more distribution and local power. And more importantly, it gives us a chance to modernize rate design. And I put a few examples there. You can have time of day rates, which they do in Ontario, where it's cheaper in the evening, for example, which helps with behavioral changes to save electricity. You can have tiered rates. If you use too much, you get charged a little bit more. Demand response rates or low income rate design. If people are struggling to pay their bills, maybe they don't pay the tax portion. And exciting for me is that there's the pilot phase of the Shediac project. Although that report isn't released, I would consider at this time that it is an example of a DER because they built about 1.63 megawatts of solar connected to the community with built-in energy storage. And as far as I've heard, that they're quite happy with that system. And I think Lori Clark could even tell you that the reliability has increased significantly. So that report will be published next year, and it's a good case study on what New Brunswick can model towards the rest of the province. The last part of my clean electricity strategy is build out of transmission infrastructure, such as the Atlantic Loop. And at this moment, I feel the full benefits of the Atlantic Loop are being lost because we see it as a silo, as a standalone project where we're going to have to constantly import from Hydro-Quebec. However, if you do a build out of renewables in the province, this does also give an export opportunity and a way for NB Power to make money back. Especially, there's talks of possibly NB Power selling off some of their generation assets. And if they were to do that, how would they make money? I would suggest through transmission, through selling, trading electricity. And of course, one of the main concerns with NB Power is the costs. Initially, the Atlantic Loop was proposed to be about $3 billion, but then it slowly increased to about $6 billion. However, the benefits are still there in 2040 and 2050, according to NB Power, and I strongly suggest it is better to take advantage of the federal budget 2023 now, while they have all that money, and ask them for more support to build it out now to help us in the future. And the last point is that there's a risk of New Brunswick being left out. There's already talks between New England and Nova Scotia of building a huge transmission line to trade offshore wind. And I'd love to see New Brunswick to be a part of that opportunity as well. Next part is affordability. Energy poverty is on the rise, and people paying over 6% of their income on energy in New Brunswick is about 115,000 households, according to the Canadian Urban Sustainability Practitioners. For me, I think there's an urgency to address the backlog of NB Power with what they have with the Enhanced Energy Savings Program. They've had about 22,000 applicants, and currently there's about 16,000 people on this wait list. People want these programs, and they need these programs. So we recommend that the provincial government or some foundations work with grassroots organizations to help NB Power, get some training and get boots on the ground to implement these. And we also suggest that NB Power publishes some case studies of the people who've made this transition to show if it works. Just to wrap up, I also think that there should be some expansion of the definition of energy poverty. The number alone of 6% is not enough. There's a lot of social factors to consider. And I've talked with some of you, these programs might not be accessible. There's people who are more vulnerable than others, such as renters, people on fixed income, or a family of 5 who make just above $70,000. They don't qualify for these programs, but they need it. So we recommend that, the definition of energy poverty be a bit expanded to include some of those things. And for my last slide here with 10 seconds left is some specific policy recommendations that I recommend. These are 3 of them. So the first is raising the energy efficiency investment targets in the Electricity Act. Right now, it's about 0.5% and going towards 0.75% by 2029. According to Efficiency Canada and a Dunsky report done for NB Power in 2020, there's some wiggle room all the way up to 1.7%. So we recommend increasing it to 1.75% by 2029 to help deal with this energy demand issue that we're seeing. Number 2 is you definitely got to raise NB Power's total in-province electricity sales from 40% to about 80 to 95%. It's very difficult to consider new renewable energy projects when the target is so low. Definitely we want higher targets and try to reach those higher targets than aim low. And finally, the last thing is consider adding an amendment to the EUB Act to include a sustainable net zero mandate. Currently, it's just acting as an economic regulator, which is fine, but it's not addressing the issues we currently have. There should be something that includes the social, environmental, and economic costs. All 3 are very important, and that's what leads to the best decision. So that's it. Just in conclusion, that from a clean electricity transition, one thing we need to stress for social acceptance is that this will lead to more affordability. It's predicted that there's going to be about a 12% decrease in energy bills by 2050 with this transition. Thank you very much, and I'm ready for questions.
Excellent presentation, Dr. Qureshi.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yes, we'll move right into our round of questions. We're going to begin with the official opposition. Mr. Lepage, do you want to take the floor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, thank you very much, Dr. B. I think you said it all in a nutshell. But I'd like you maybe to dive into maybe a little bit more. I didn't hear you talk about the timing, the urgency, and I'd like you maybe to discuss to us about the timing. We're in 2023 right now, at the end of 2023. When should we move, and on what subject?
Excellent question. There is an urgency to act, as we've seen from, the IEA just released a report on pathways to net zero. The IPCC also released it earlier this year. There is definitely an urgency to do stuff now. And that's one of the other things, when I'm pushing this portfolio approach with a huge stress on wind and solar, is because these technologies are ready to deploy today. And as I said, New Brunswick in the past has already built 100 megawatts of wind within a year for Kent Hills and for Caribou. So not only are these technologies ready today, they can start solving the problem today. There's always that talk between wind and SMRs, and SMRs, I do understand why it's being considered, but that technology is not ready till 2035. So when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, you have lung cancer, you need to stop smoking, do you stop smoking today or do you stop smoking 10 years from now? So I think it's important that we start addressing these problems today and start implementing some of these solar and wind projects coupled with storage sooner rather than later. And I think what I'm proposing is that you would have about 1,100 megawatts by 2035. And if you continue that model, you'll also reach what NB Power predicts to be 2,000 megawatts by 2045 anyway. So I think I tried to structure it in a way that's reasonable, attainable, and achievable, in my opinion. So I think it can be implemented sooner rather than later.
Now, we should do that, no problem, but whose responsibility is it? Is it NB Power's, or is it government?
I would definitely say both. I think the government has a responsibility to fix some of these, the Electricity Act and the EUB Act that gives NB Power the ability to deploy these projects a bit faster, and definitely considering the impact of social, environmental, and economic impacts of these proposals. So there's definitely a responsibility on both sides. And what would be nice for transparency as well is including New Brunswickers on this. They want to be involved with it. They want to hear what's being considered, get their feedback, and roll out with a plan. Actually, the Conservation Council hosted a citizens' assembly in February this year, where we brought a few New Brunswickers together to talk about what they want to see in an electricity system. And some of them even proposed that they're willing to join in the transition, possibly buying green bonds, for example, to build out some of this infrastructure. So there is a high interest from New Brunswickers. It's just there's a lack of data and information in an accessible form. The way I presented it now is it's very high level and it's for us to talk about. But when we talk to the community, we definitely need a better strategy for that, which I can offer suggestions on that too.
Completely agree that we need citizen engagement. How about education, literacy? Because otherwise, we will not convince my father to turn on the light or to switch his habits if he doesn't understand why he's doing it. So how do we get there?
I think the key thing, Gilles, is that we need to make it personal. It's not about me, the scientist, saying, hey, this is the right thing to do, or you, the MLA, saying, hey, this is the right thing to do. We talked before that I believe you recently had a heat pump installed. Instead of you as an MLA, it should be you as a homeowner saying that, hey, I recently got a heat pump. I'm saving about $100, $200 a month. And this is why one of my recommendations for NB Power was to start publishing these case studies. People want a personal story. That's how you get that social acceptance. People have already started making the switch. And right now, all we're seeing is that, you can save this. Even in my slide, I'm saying your bills will decrease by 12%. That's all math. But what some of you guys have already done in your transition, those are real numbers. You should show what your bills are before and what your bills are after. And really, I think that's the way to start convincing New Brunswickers that this is the change that they want, that they can be a part of it as well and start saving money.
Look, this will conclude my question. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Perfect,
I know that
absolutely.
my colleague Keith has a few questions for you. Thank you.
Great. Yourself, Keith?
Too bad. I've got 3 questions.
Absolutely. Bring it.
First one is the timeline for wind energy. It's a pretty aggressive timeline, 100
It is.
megawatts a year.
I'm a stubborn optimist.
Just to kind of help people better understand the scope of what you're suggesting, what's the environmental footprint of 100 megawatt project?
Fantastic question. When I first started talking about this earlier this year, a lot of questions came up about land use. How much land are we going to need for all this wind, all this solar? Well, actually, there's already been some studies done by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States, and they did an analysis that if the United States were to take their entire grid and do 100% renewables, they calculated the land area that it would require. And it is a lot smaller than you'd think it is. To power the US, it would take the same amount of land use space as all the airport infrastructure in the US currently, or all the current coal facilities as well. So it does take a lot of area, but it's not as bad as people make it out to be, because we've already used that area for other projects, and at least with wind and solar, these technologies have the ability to be multi-purpose. You can put the solar panel on the rooftop, right? So, I mean, no one's using the roofs anyway for anything. So you can, and even wind, you can combine it with farmers. The cows can still graze while the wind power is still blowing. So although there is, I won't say there's no environmental impact. You know, there is an effect on birds, there is, but I feel that's a lot, the negative effects are a lot smaller than some of the other alternative options.
Thanks for the information. Obviously, that's a sticking point for a lot of people when we're talking about wind energy and
Of course,
wind
yeah,
projects.
it needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Second question I've got, battery storage technology. Just kind of give us an update of where we're at as like, where is the industry at? And how, like, what's coming down the pipe when it comes to battery storage technology?
So I'm quite excited about battery storage technology because recently there was a report, apologies, I'm forgetting the institution at the moment, but where they made a huge breakthrough in solid-state batteries. And that, to me, will be the future if that technology were to go through. What solid-state batteries offer compared to the conventional liquid batteries we have now is that they could hold a lot more charge for a lot longer, and they're a lot faster. So a solid is literally, it's a ceramic, kind of like a plate or whatever, but with obviously specialized material. And as you know, like how, now I'm getting into, I'm a chemist, so now I'm getting into it. So as when liquids move around versus solids, the way the electrons move in a solid is significantly faster and it can hold a lot more. So that technology is not ready yet. I do think it'll take several years to do that. However, with the current technologies for lithium, vanadium, and some flow batteries, lithium and flow batteries are ready to deploy now. Some are a bit, I wish I showed the other figure as well, which in this report, I have it in the links. They also show the levelized cost of capacity, and they show the cost of capacity of SMRs and batteries as well. And the key thing is the decline rate as well. The batteries are getting cheaper and cheaper every year, and it's now a major research focus. And everyone's finding ways to make them cheaper and optimized. So I do think, once again, with my iterative idea, is that you start deploying some batteries now, and next year the technology is already improving, so you can get a next generation. And then when those old one breaks, you can replace it with something new. Whereas, you know, if you think of these major infrastructure, if something breaks, you can't just replace it. You have to replace it with the same thing, and you're not really advancing. So the model I'm giving, it's smaller scale, but you're constantly moving forward, is how I think of it.
Thank you very much for that. We could actually speak on that.
But I got all that.
I'm limited with time, yes. So my last question I want to get to before my time's up.
Sure.
You kind of talked about the export possibilities with the Atlantic Loop. So as I agree with my colleagues on the government side that, you know, I have reservations with the Atlantic Loop. Fair. And what's the benefit for the province of New Brunswick. You mentioned that there was possibility of maybe, you know, if we have surplus capacity with wind energy, that we could actually just throw it onto the loop. Have you heard any echoes that the feds are actually open to that? Or the project, or, you know, obviously the feds are leading the project, that they're giving us that possibility as a province to be able to feed the Atlantic Loop with our surplus energy? Because I haven't heard anything, but maybe with your talks, maybe you've got insight that you could share with us.
I'll have to think about that a bit more, but how I see it in my head is that our current transmission infrastructure, I think of it as all the roads that we have, and the Atlantic Loop is like a highway. So if you're trying to drive from New Brunswick to Ontario, you're taking the highway all the way there. You're not taking the small roads there. And what I'm proposing, this distributed energy system, one of the weak points is that it does need more transmission. But I also see that as a strength, that with more transmission being involved, that if Hydro-Quebec is struggling, which it has in the past, I mean, we think about February of this year when they stopped exporting to us, their demand is also increasing. All of our neighbors, all of their demands are increasing. And I do believe that if we had the Atlantic Loop, because it should be bidirectional transmission system, that if we had excess, I don't see why it couldn't be sold to our neighbors. I haven't spoke to the feds about this, but I will, Keith, and I'll get back to you on that. But from my understanding, I don't see why you can't sell it.
Thank you very much.
Yep, no problem.
All good with your side? Okay, we'll move over to government side. And who'd like to begin? Minister Holland?
Good morning, Dr. Qureshi. Moe, good to
Good
see
morning,
you.
man. Good to
Always
see
a
you.
pleasure to have a chance to talk about such an exciting series of subjects. You started your comments about lung cancer. And if you're diagnosed, you're not going to stop smoking 5 years from now. I agree. You're going to immediately stop smoking, and also simultaneously, I think you're going to employ a number of different solutions at the same time.
Definitely.
You know, it's not either or, it's both and, not either or. So I want to kind of talk about multiple approaches here.
Sure.
You know, the hydrogen industrial application, you know, we talk about that from the purpose of energy. What kind of a dive have you done into the impact that that can possibly have as alternative fuel sources for shipping and a variety of different large-scale industrial uses under the one environment, total reductions? What are you hopeful about what that can bring about?
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there. So to begin, the reason why I said I don't think hydrogen is ready as an energy source, if I can just give an example of an electric vehicle versus a fuel cell electric vehicle. The fuel cell one is about 3 times less efficient than the current EVs. So it doesn't make sense to really focus on hydrogen fuel cells at the moment, because it's just a bit more costly, a bit more expensive. There was an analysis done that if you were to use heat pumps from electricity or green hydrogen, and once again, the cost for green hydrogen to heat your home are just way too expensive. However, I do stress that hydrogen is still very valuable as a chemical. You really need it to make steel. You need it to make fertilizer. Currently all of the hydrogen is made through fossil fuels, and it would be nice to see that hydrogen be made from green sources. What I would recommend, and this would also require opening up the Electricity Act, is that if industrial companies wanted to produce their own hydrogen for their own industrial purposes, I'm not against that. And also, I stress that hydrogen, it's most cost-effective and environmentally sustainable if it's produced and used locally. When you start transporting it over large distances, that's where you start getting into problems. You get a lot of leaks, or you get into this system of huge inefficiencies, right? So think of it this way. If you were to export hydrogen to Europe, for example, you make the hydrogen here. There's 2 ways to get it across, either as hydrogen or you convert it to ammonia, for example. Yep. If you keep it as hydrogen, that's a lot of tanks, a lot of leakage, and over all the ocean, you know, so there's a lot of problems there. But if you convert it to ammonia, you send it over, and then do they convert it back to hydrogen? Like, it's a very strange, inefficient process. It would really make more sense if they would just make their own hydrogen locally. If they needed ammonia, and you convert it to ammonia and they use ammonia, that's a different story. But if you're converting it back and forth to hydrogen, that's quite inefficient and costly.
I guess regardless of the process involved, the end result, if we can see that become beyond the energy component, beyond the industrial application of steel, et cetera, I think that if that conversion process can take place in a cost-effective way, that has a massive impact on the reduction of our emissions in our global transportation system.
It does. I will still stress that I think EVs are still the better choice. Sure. But you do have a point that, you know, just greening hydrogen in general will lead to...
I'm talking about industrial.
Sorry, apologies. Yeah, for
Yeah,
industrial, absolutely. I think that is a huge way to reduce emissions, because hydrogen is produced all over the world, but all through fossil fuels. I think 99% of it right now is through fossil fuels. So
I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the battery components, storage component, and I'm always wary of unintended consequences when I embark upon looking at anything. And so we've got the lithium ion, they've got the 4-hour discharge. We got the vanadium, they're about 8. Yeah. Okay. We still have a gap there. And so one of the questions I've been asking is, it's a sincere question. we want to see us move in the direction of renewables. However, in an isolated fashion, we can make a case around it. But in the absence of the storage that will fill the gap, we have to ensure that we have that firm baseload power. So for every 1 megawatt of the renewable, we have to have it backed up with a megawatt of firm, which seems like quite a significant cost to be added to it. How do we deal with the fact that in the absence of sustainable battery supplies, that we've got to kind of double up megawatt per megawatt? And so how do we avoid unintended costs as it related to that? And if so, what is the alternative firm power choice that we would have?
Valid question there, valid question. How I would address that is typically, if I look back for a second at NB Power's IRP, and they had a sensitivity analysis, and one of them was, what if there's no SMRs? What it showed is that you're going to have to really overbuild wind and solar. And even so, that's not the most expensive option, but still, what I recommend is that when you're building out this wind, I don't think you need a 1-to-1. I would recommend 20%. And if you're overbuilding a little bit and you have 20% backed up, I think that will still ensure reliability. Because before you go, I did hear Lori Clark at Public Accounts last week, and she did mention with Shediac that, of course, once the report comes out, we'll know more details. But when the tropical storm Fiona hit, I think about a few percent of the Shediac, about 10%, opted out of the program, and the rest stayed in. The ones who opted out lost power, but everyone who opted in kept their power online. So I do understand your point but I don't think you exactly need a 1-to-1 backup. I think 20% is good. And also with batteries, you can connect it in series with each other. So even though it's 4 hours, if you keep building it out,
It could scale?
It could scale, yeah. It could scale.
Yeah, but the overbuilding, in the absence of wind diversity, though, in the province, which, from what I understand, we have such a small geographic footprint that we don't have significant wind diversity. So how would an overbuild accomplish anything there?
Well, I would say I disagree with that, because I have a
We've always agreed on everything up until now.
yeah, well, in this external links, that second last link there, unlocking the potential distributed, oh, sorry, that's not the right link. I'll share the link later, but what I'm saying is that New Brunswick does have a diverse mix of wind, and more importantly, I'm not focused on each part of this as a silo, right? I'm thinking of the whole connected system. So when I'm proposing a distributed system, and if it's combined with the Atlantic Loop, for example, I find it very unlikely that, you're not going to find wind everywhere. And earlier this year, when we talked about, wind was offline during that storm in early February, the first thing I did was I called up all the wind operators all over the Atlantic, and about 80% of them were online during the storm. It was very unlucky what happened in New Brunswick because Kent Hills was offline. Lamec did struggle. But I do think there is enough varied sources of renewable energy
I'd love to get, if you got some links and some data on that.
I do.
And then in the vein of unintended consequences, you talk about taking the Electricity Act, or the EUB Act, and opening that up to allow for consideration beyond the fiscal and move into environmental, social, and whatnot. I talk about unintended consequences, but at that point, what would the impact be? And this is ignorant of specific data, so I look forward to your feedback. But if the EUB has the opportunity to look at the not just the economic impact, but the environmental impact, would they be taking into consideration the environmental impact of heavy metal mining, the geographic footprint, like my colleague over there talked about, and could we be in a situation where EUB's weighting of renewables could find itself in a situation where it comes up short compared to others because you've got to factor in the environmental impact of the creation of that?
Absolutely, mining needs to be considered, and we definitely are a big proponent for sustainable and circular economy mining practices and recycling any of these materials and high-value metals. In fact, it's now a major research area of regenerating these valuable metals. Typically, in the past, we've always just thrown them away and lose them, but now there's a lot of procedures in place to recover a lot of these materials. But for sure, I don't think wind and solar need special treatment. They should be given the same treatment as any other thing. They should go through those impact assessments. They should go through those mining concerns. And, but I still believe that when you consider all of that, I still think there's a story and there's a case for it. But I'm not saying that shouldn't be considered. Absolutely, that's part of the process.
Well, I come from that question as the person that would be framing it up, like my experience within the department, because looking at all the tentacles of where it could go.
Absolutely, and I'm in favor of that approach where everything should be considered rather than just, you know,
in isolation.
In isolation, absolutely.
Quick question, if you have the information, tremendous. If not, you get it to us. How did you monetize the difference between the first-of-a-kind SMR and the nth of a kind?
Oh, I see.
2.4 to 2.1, yeah. What was the data points that were used to do that?
So just for this math, and I will say it's crude, but I just put it here just to emphasize how good solar and wind is. So you're talking about where I got those numbers from? So I got it from this table, from the E3 report, which I'm sending the link to you. And from that report, this is the capital costs. So it shows wind, solar, biomass, storage, natural gas, and nuclear. And from those capital costs, all I did was look that it says nuclear small reactor 300 megawatts, but the value is in dollar per kilowatt. So I just did the math, converted everything, and
I'm going to kind of nerd out on the details with that.
Please do, please do.
Are we talking Gen 4, Gen 3?
Oh, that I don't have those details.
Okay.
In the report that I got from, it doesn't explain the difference in those generations. So I don't have that. Yep.
Any chance you could dig that up?
You know what? For you, Mike, I will.
That's how it goes. The DERs strongly agree, the smart meters strongly agree. Time of day rates absolutely agree. The cheapest megawatt is the one we don't use.
Absolutely, cheapest megawatt is the one we don't use.
That's the one we don't use.
Efficiency needs to be emphasized
100%.
and increased.
And your recommendations about fleshing out the efficiency program, all that stuff. There's some really good stuff there.
Really needs to happen. And increasing the accessibility, because there's so many rural communities who might not have access to it.
How can we deal with, and the last one will be an unintended consequence of, in the event that we move in that direction and we talk about doing things that allow the rooftop and we have situations where we have people creating their own resiliency and self-supply. Every time we remove one of those from the utility, we remove a ratepayer from the utility. And therefore, we equalize that cost or amortize it over all the remaining ratepayers. What advice would you have for protecting the utility and ultimately protecting the ultimate New Brunswick ratepayers so that we don't get in a situation where we tip that balance and those that remain pay the price?
Well, first and foremost, that if a lot of these industrial folks were to get off the grid, you're right, there will be consequences on everyone else, but that shouldn't be dealt with immediately. It needs to be stretched out, those costs over time, to lower the rates. But definitely, how I see it in an ideal situation is that if you have this build out of clean energy, you do definitely have an opportunity to export to New England and some other regions. Alternate, because already NB Power, from their annual report, to make up for some of the debt, they increased sales of their fossil fuels. I would say it's a bit more ethical to increase sales of the renewables. So I think there is still a case study to generate some income, but I don't fully have the answer to that question, but that's the important question that needs to be asked and considered. How do we make sure it's fair on the ratepayers? And I think that's what the EUB needs to consider, because right now, if it's only economics, that social aspect is exactly how you do it. So you're right, I don't have the exact answer, but the strategy I'm giving you will help you find that answer.
And the conversation will continue.
And the conversation will never end, I'm sure.
Thank you for your questions, Minister Holland. We'll now move over to our third party, and Ms. Minton, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here this morning.
My pleasure.
I'd like to pick up on the issue of regional coordination. Could you speak to the importance of that and what that might look like, and maybe even some examples where that exists now.
Yeah, regional coordination is extremely important, and I've already identified some gaps that I've seen. I will be sending a more thorough report on my clean electricity strategy. This is only a part of my recommendations, but for the regional gap, there's right now the NPCC, I forget the exact acronym, but North Power Coordinating Council, which includes a lot of New England, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, but it doesn't include PEI or Newfoundland and Labrador. And that's a huge problem, especially when you're talking about huge infrastructure projects like the Atlantic Loop. So every region needs to be considered. And for sure, teamwork is the best way forward. Everyone's demand is increasing, and every region is going to have a different distribution mix. Some regions will have more wind and solar. Some we have, if we're proposing SMRs and wind and solar. So each region has their own mix. And through that regional cooperation, I mean, I'm hoping that where there's gaps in one area, it can be filled by another. So I definitely think that the Atlantic provinces need to work together to make sure that we have electricity to trade with each other, with New England, especially as an export opportunity, and eventually connect with the rest of the Canadian grid. I do, in the long-term future, I mean, we're talking about Atlantic Loop now, but I do see a future where all of Canada is kind of connected on a electricity highway like the Atlantic Loop, so that way if there's wind in Saskatchewan, they have too much, they could bring it over to us as well. So it's definitely very important, and more needs to happen. It definitely requires governments to talk to each other to make a plan together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There have been some things that have come up with multiple presenters talking about making sure the mandate includes, like for MB Power, for example, and includes ambitious goals, government legislating those things, considering not just the affordability of the energy, but other things. Could you speak to the issue of affordability, looking at like the cost of what someone's bill would be versus the rate? Because I just heard, and I will agree with the minister, the cheapest megawatt is one we don't use. And so how does that play in? How does efficiency connect with that issue of what the rate might look like versus what people are paying at home?
Very good question, Megan. So what I would say, if we think of what's happening right now, we're already having a rate increase of about 4.8%, and even MB Power is going to court on this to get it to the full 8.9%. So rates are already increasing, and it's no secret that, you know, with this transition, of course, a lot of costs come with it in terms of transmission, more build out of different technologies and generation assets. The key thing, though, is that there is a lot of support from the federal government right now, especially with the budget 2023. There's about $20 billion there for clean energy. And more importantly, that provinces who have more to change do have a priority over a lot of this money. So there's more money available for New Brunswick specifically because there's a lot more to transition here. So that's one thing to help address some of these costs and affordability issues. But when we talk about rates versus bills, even though rates going up, as Minister Holland said, that the best megawatt is the megawatt saved. So with the Enhanced Energy Savings Program, I mean, they're looking at the entire house, they're adding heat pumps, they're considering the insulation of the home. And even though rates go up, if you're using a fraction of the electricity you were using before, you will save money. So, and I think this is something that really needs to be communicated to the public. It's very hard to do, but that's where my recommendation of personalizing some of these stories come from. You show someone before the EESP program how inefficient their house was, what their windows looked like, their baseboard heating, and show what that bill actually was. and then show after the change what infrastructure changes happened and how much money did that save, how much GHG emissions did that save. That's what people want to hear. They want to hear those case studies. And recently, we published a video on our website of one example of a case study of someone who switched in Nova Scotia, and they're saving a few thousand a year. So I think that's what New Brunswickers need to see and understand. It's not, I think everyone here understands, but it's not intuitive that, you know, rates go up, bills go down. If rates go up, you simply think that you're going to be paying more. But if you do that energy efficiency and consider that affordability, those rates can go down because you're just using a fraction of it. And I think at Clean Energy Canada, they just published a report yesterday or the day before talking about the cost savings from these technologies. And I think they said that, you know, with the EV and heat pump, you could be saving $800 a month. And I think that's what people want to start seeing. They want to start seeing people who've made that change. Is that true? And so far, we are seeing it is yes. So definitely, we need to socialize it a bit more and make it a bit more personal and show that, you know, here are some New Brunswickers who made the change, and you can too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And what I'm hearing is it wouldn't just help to address the climate crisis, it'll help with people's pocketbooks, it'll help with savings in their household budget.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yes.
even though what I'm proposing here is what I believe to be the most cost-effective, but also the most sustainable option as well. And so you're saving money in your wallet, you're saving the environment, and you know what, added bonus, you're saving your health too. You know, so we're going to have less pollutants in the air, a lot cleaner air, and I think everyone's for that too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I heard you use an example earlier of a 5-person household, maybe just over the 70,000 mark, but still experiencing energy poverty. I literally have an example of a constituent in that situation right now who's not eligible for the programs, but is struggling to make ends meet and would really benefit. So, so I just wanted to note that I think that's an important point. To look at the definitions and look of energy poverty and who's included, because the most vulnerable are being the most impacted.
If I could add to that, I mean, earlier this May, I attended NB Power's Energizing Efficiency Conference, and there was a lecture on energy poverty. And there was a lot of NB Power employees who are on the ground implementing these programs. And some of the stories they had to share, it was a very powerful and emotional conversation that happened. We're talking about people who have to choose between food and their bills. We're talking about New Brunswickers who might not have the literacy skills to fill out some of these forms. We're talking about New Brunswickers in rural communities who might have a distrust in the government or utilities, so they're not ready to take on some of these programs. So I think the accessibility needs to be improved, and more importantly, when we talk about the ESP, it's a low-income kind of program, but we got to think of the next steps. After the low income, what's next? It's got to be the middle class, and the middle class needs some love too, right? So this program needs to be vamped up. We need more boots on the ground. We need more investment into it, and it'll take a lot of load off the grid. Every model is showing, you know, population is increasing, demand is increasing, and any strategy to reduce demand will save countless of dollars in the future.
Thank you for making that point. I think that I think energy efficiency is becoming a bigger part of the conversation, but it needs to be prioritized up front. Excuse me. Okay, I forget the point I was going to make. But I will move on to another question. Could you speak to the importance of independent pathway assessments, please?
Yes, I think the independent pathway is quite important because everyone in this room is a bit too close to the topic. So it would be nice to have an assessment that really looks at different situations. You know, if you think of NB Power's IRP, they did have 16 modeled scenarios and some sensitivity analysis. But if you do look at all the models, they aren't exactly completely different from one another. There's small variables changing here. What I would like to see is what would a distributed energy system look like? What, if we continue how we're doing right now, if we do this distribution mix, if we do this distribution, so trying to think a bit outside of the box. And I really need to stress, this is a pivotal moment for New Brunswick. So we're thinking of developing a clean electricity strategy that's going to last up until 2050. You got to start thinking of out-of-the-box thinking, because what we're doing right now is simply not working. The debt is just increasing. Rates are going up, and up. So what we're doing right now is simply not working. You need a serious assessment, and hopefully maybe a third party can provide that, of alternatives that can help reduce those costs.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Just briefly go back to, I remembered my point around energy efficiency and household costs. I see so many constituents who are facing those issues, trying to decide whether to pay their NB power bill or to buy food, trying to figure out where they're going to get wood, how they're going to survive the winter. And I'm starting to hear from people, how are they going to get through this winter as it cools down. I'm wondering if you can, not to belabor the point, but again, I think this is really important. Can you talk about any research you've seen? I know you just mentioned a study that came out yesterday from Efficiency, or was it Efficiency or
Clean Energy Canada.
Clean Energy Canada.
Efficiency Canada also has a lot of great reports on this too.
Yeah, can you speak to this issue of what household costs are likely to look like in a just transition?
Well, it ties into some of your earlier questions as well. So the cost for a just transition, other things to consider as well is possibly, I think they have the PACE program in Nova Scotia as well. So there are different options to help homeowners address some of these costs in the transition. And from the savings they're going to see, it can pay for a lot of these technologies. So I would say that we need a bit more communication with the general public, showing that that making that change is how you prepare for the future. Yeah, sorry.
If you'll allow me, could I just ask Dr. Qureshi to just briefly define PACE program, because I don't know if everyone knows what you mean.
I'm blanking on exactly what it stands for, but it's a program that kind of homeowners can take to revamp their home and do a lot of these upgrades at a very low interest to zero interest rate. So that's very helpful, and then they can take out that loan and pay it back slowly over months. And the key thing is the low rate, so that it's not really encumbersome onto the homeowner. Yeah, and one thing just to finish off, to answer your previous question, which I kind of missed, there's a lot of academics recently now starting to work on energy poverty and trying to flesh out this definition. There's Mylène Riva in McGill University and a few others that I know of. So I think working with those academics to really flesh out the more details of it, because I'm still learning it myself, but now that academics are getting involved, I'm sure they have a lot more to say. And I believe there's a professor even here at UNB, Heather Miller, who's starting to work on this as well. So that's definitely a resource that you guys should talk to and get more information from.
Great. Thank you for your questions, Ms. Mitten, and thank you for your presentation, Dr. Qureshi, and answering all the questions from our members. At this time, if you'd like to make a few closing remarks.
Sure. With the proposed clean electricity regulations that are coming out, and NB Power's IRP has their models already contain a lot of the CER's proposals. They're assuming a lot of their fossil fuel plants will be operating at 5% capacity in the future. This is now kind of the time to develop a strategy that includes incentives to switch that includes rigorous policy changes to make sure that, you know, NB Power has the flexibility and resources to start making that social, economic, and environmental changes it needs to do in its strategy. And I'm optimistic that you guys will make a great plan.
Thank you again. That was an excellent, very informative presentation. So I appreciate you being here today and addressing our committee, and very well done. So thank you for that.